Happens to everyone. Hello,
It happens
everyone.
to
Welcome to the
us.
Backpack Show. It happens to everyone. Everybody
Wow,
stumbles over words sometimes.
that's true.
I just, yeah,
Well, I
I've
think it was
tried not
Anthony
to.
Kiedis was the first person who said to complete the motion if you stumble. So I think that's good advice. Um,
Mhm. So
so
excited about today.
who do we have today? Probably someone with a birthday.
So yes, one of my three words for 2022, my goal setting words was wellspring, and I determined to consume more creative content like fiction and stuff, not business stuff, so I could get my creative juices flowing again. That included horror novels, and I came across Waubgeshig Rice's book Moon of the Crusted Snow, and it's a post-apocalyptic thriller set in a First Nation community up north, and things start to unravel, and it's like whoa, it's so intense. So I had to talk to him. I saw on Twitter when I looked him up that he's a metalhead, and I was like, yes, but he's a journalist, was with CBC for a long time, retired in 2020 to be a full-time author, and I couldn't be more happy because that means now there's a sequel to Moon of the Crusted Snow.
And
Or
I'm a
gonna be.
freak for post-apocalyptic stuff, but I've got to ask questions about what it's like for First Nation because they should have it in the bag, shouldn't they?
Hi everyone, Tim Kitzer from NBA Jam and NFL Blitz, welcoming you to The Backpack Show. Your hosts, Chris Brogan, Kerry Gargone, Boom Shakalaka.
Backpack Show.
I had the same thought, I was like, if you gotta be somewhere when the world falls apart, it'd be nice to be somewhere where people, as a community, like they can hunt and fish and stuff, because I
That's
can't.
right. They got it all figured out. But we'll
Take a
bring
survival
Waubgeshig
course.
on and we'll ask him the question. Mr. Rice, First Nation apocalypse. This sounds like it's a easy, right?
Well, I like to think I'd be a little more prepared than I actually am if the actual stuff hit the fan. But yeah, what prompted the whole idea was the big blackout of 2003, which I think you all experienced out your way too. I was home on the res at that time. I had been living in Toronto working as a freelance journalist, but I was home when the lights went out, and it was actually, really comforting to be there, to be around people who were resourceful and like knew how to, gather food and medicine from the bush and hunt and all that. So it's like, okay, if this happens again, I'm definitely coming back to the res. And that's sort of where the story all began. That was the catalyst.
That's exciting. And so you're part of the Anishinaabe people. I knew I was going to stumble over the
No, it
Anishinaabe
sounded
people.
good.
But that makes up 8 or so tribes, right? That's Algonquin, that's Ojibwe, that's Cree. Is Cree one of them?
Cree's, separate but still related,
Okay.
right? Like
Okay.
the same sort of language group. But yeah, the Anishinaabe umbrella is pretty big, and it spans from like, southern Quebec all the way out to Manitoba, down to Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, and
Wow.
so on. So basically, around the whole Great Lakes is the Anishinaabe territory.
When writing into that, I mean, you want to obviously kind of write your closest culture. You want to write your particular
Mm-hmm.
groups, but sort of writing into this larger. I keep thinking of words like conglomerate, which is
Mm-hmm.
so not the right word, but like this vaster group of people.
Yeah.
Did you take any of that kind of a thing into effect? Like, is it something like, well, an Algonquin would do this, but someone else wouldn't, or is that way too far down the road?
No, I had to be really careful and consider a lot of those nuances within the wider Anishinaabe nation, right? Because I placed the community in the story in far northern Ontario, where Anishinaabe people live, but like it was informed entirely by my experience of growing up on the Great Lakes, right? So how I worked around that was saying, okay, the people in the story are originally from the Great Lakes, but when colonization happened, they were displaced up to the far north, which happened to a lot of indigenous communities when Canada and the United States were settled, right? So I guess that was my workaround in some ways.
You mentioned so many of those things, though. Every character, every part of the story is interwoven with the culture, not just the way I think a lot of people who've consumed kind of mainstream media or whatever have a very skewed idea of what First Nation means. And they sort of skip over the part where the government intentionally tried to strip you of your culture and not let you speak the language and all that kind of stuff. You put it right, it's right there. It's right
Mm-hmm.
there. Like, and the pieces where you're having kids try to relearn the language from elders and stuff. I mean, it's got to be hard. What are some of the things that you made purposeful decisions about in terms of traditions to share? Like, were you thinking this is important to preserve, or were you just like, this is an important part of the story, like saging before a meeting or something like
Mhm.
that?
Yeah, I think, what I really tried to draw from the most was my own personal experience, what my upbringing in my community was like, and how my culture, and the knowledge of my ancestors really informed the current path that I'm on. And I think if I tried to step outside of that, it might not have been as authentic a portrayal of, what a community can be like. So considering all that, though, like most indigenous nations, most communities across what our people call Turtle Island, which is North America, have experienced similar measures, right? Similar brutalities, essentially, and it's just really finding a way to not necessarily beat people over the head with that historical context, but like interweave it within the day to day, So, like, for example, in my day to day life, I'll try to relay words in Ojibwe, or what we call Nishnabemo, into my kids. And then, I'll take a moment to reflect on just how I have been separated from that language myself, And when you're writing like a fictional narrative, you have the opportunity to provide that context in kind of an active way, I think. And that's what I really appreciate about writing fiction compared to when I was a journalist. Like I worked for CBC for a long time, and I had some really awesome opportunities to interview people from various indigenous communities and help them relay their realities and their truths. But like when you're working in mainstream media, you're confined by time limits, by space. And I find weirdly that with fiction, you can get to the heart of a lot of that context in more humanizing ways, because you have a lot more space. You have the opportunity to really massage it to your own storytelling, I guess, sort of skills, So I think a lot of that came out naturally, but I was very careful with a lot of it too, because there's just so much there, and you can't exactly squeeze it all into, a 220-page novel, right? So.
Scary books. Why scary books? For journalism, write to scary things.
Yeah, I wasn't really that mindful of how, the story would fall into different subgenres by the time it was out. I was just writing the story that I felt like I wanted to do. And of course, I wanted it to be scary. I wanted to scare myself as I was writing it, but I didn't really foresee how it could be categorized as horror, or sci-fi, or even fantasy, some fantastical elements to it. And I think once it was released, readers from those communities latched onto the story, and it was really enlightening for me, but also really empowering at the same time. It's like, wow, I didn't really consider how I can make these connections with people. I was just doing an Anishinaabe story, that's how I saw it, right? But there are like elements in our day-to-day realities, there are elements in our traditional stories that sort of fall in line with all those different kinds of horrific or speculative or fantastical or whatever else elements. So it's neat to be able to have this connection with different kinds of readers through this story, essentially.
Now, you'd written another couple of books on the way to this book, and one of them was sort of a much more character-driven story about people kind of all experiencing a sweat lodge. And so to go into post-apoc like this and to make it kind of a little more thriller-ish, what did that give you, and what did that take away as far as your writing goes?
That's an interesting question, and I don't think I really thought about this that deeply until Moon of the Crusted Snow was out, because I think with those first two books that I had out, it was more about, I guess, trying to find my voice as a writer, trying to reckon with, my personal history, my people's history, my community's history, and how that all could unfold in, I guess, a literary way, and, looking back with like what I've learned about writing and storytelling in that way, I might not have written those stories in the same way. But it goes back to what I was saying earlier about that authenticity of just trying to convey what our realities can be, And those first two books deal with some pretty heavy themes, of dealing with, the post-contact world and so on. But I think getting those heavy themes out of the way for me allowed me to focus more on like a specific genre story, like a speculative fiction story. And I had a lot more fun. There was a lot less emotional connection to the subject matter for me. It was just an opportunity for me to write the story that I'd always wanted to write, and it was a blast. It's weird to say, oh, I wrote this end of the world story that's, violent and occasionally gruesome, but I had a blast doing it, so, but that's how it was for me.
It is gruesome. Like, you don't shy away from the horrors of society falling apart. So yeah, so be prepared for that if you read Moon of the Crusted Snow. It's not like
warning.
a feel-good
Get a little
story.
But it's 2 questions that relate to that, by the way. Evan White's guy. So one of the things that's also true of that kind of fiction is that people really hook to the character. Like they really they want to think about the character a lot. They want to believe in the character. In their head, they're calling your next one an Evan White's guy book. Like that's not necessarily how you put it. And then I watched. I love author myself. I love to read my 1 stars. I usually. I put a little glass in my mouth and drink hot sauce and read 1-star reviews and cry. And one of the things that they said was they were saying, well, he's a bit of a loose cannon and he's violent and it seems like everybody around him just kind of ignores that. And I had a weird connection of a question. This is a circuitous kind of a question. So my ex-wife was raised in Labrador. And there was an Inuit group not too far off who had they had it rough. Like nothing went good for them, and the way the government treated them was awful. And they kept trying to make it better, and it would just get worse.
Yeah.
And so one of the fellows up there, his name was Jimmy Two Trees, and the kind of joke about Jimmy Two Trees, if you'd want to call it a joke, is he was really super nice unless he was drunk, and then he'd probably try to stab you, but only when he's drunk. So So the kind of joke was, well, that's just Jimmy Two Trees. Like that was how it was. Is there any connection to anything I just said, or like what is it about him that let people not respond to him sometimes? Even though he was kind of getting a little crazy from time to time.
Evan White's guy, you mean the protagonist?
Yeah.
I think how people may not connect with him is because he is more or less subdued for the most part throughout the story. He's very humble and he's an anti-hero in a lot of ways. I think the trope when it comes to like post-apocalyptic fiction is there's usually one dude, one hero who's gonna lead everybody to safety or beat all the zombies or whatever else, right? But that's not that realistic at all. And for me, having experienced the blackout in my home community back in 2003, there wasn't like one guy who was going to help us all through it. We all worked together. We decided who around us was resourceful. We decided who we could help if they needed it and so on, right? So Evan sort of fits into that in that way. But he also has like some underlying, he recognizes the necessity for violence if he has to go there, and that's, part of protecting his community, part of protecting his loved ones. But he also, wants to fit in with the wider, initiative of keeping everybody safe and healthy, So I think that's why people who read most post-apocalyptic or dystopian fiction may not necessarily connect with him because he's not just the superhero dude, upholding like the patriarchy of the savior, So it's interesting to consider because I didn't want him to be that guy at all. Although I did want him to have these sort of necessary moments of violence and protection if he needed it, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm. I was gauging the actions of people in Moon of the Crusted Snow by like seasons of The Walking Dead. Like, oh, they're still like season 1 of The Walking Dead. Like, they're not there yet. And then a little bit later, you're like, okay, now it's like season 4. Like you can see it start to go downhill. So I was definitely ready for that. But it's the importance of community definitely comes through. Like you say, there's not one hero. There's there is an antagonist, but he's not acting totally alone. So that comes across. Now that you've talked about oral storytelling and the tradition of it, and I know that played a role in your crafting of the story, I'm interested to know when you tell a story orally versus when you write it down as a novel, like how much kind of leeway would a storyteller have to tell Moon of the Crusted Snow themselves, like what what has to stay, what has to go, without giving away plot points, like how, you know, how much give is there in it, in oral storytelling versus writing down?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've always, as a writer, I've always believed that if I want to, draw inspiration from the stories of my people, more or less adapting those stories, from an oral way into a written way, much like you'd adapt, a novel to a screen sort of adaptation, right? And there are obviously important points that need to stay. There are morals that need to be relayed as well. And I think that's what's at the essence of what we would call traditional oral storytelling in our culture, is that, there are, the characters that you need to talk about. There are, the plot points throughout that particular story. But the biggest thing you want to leave the listener with is a moral or a lesson, something that they can take away from that experience of sitting with you and hearing that story, so that they could relay that to somebody else. And the story itself only proliferates, like the lesson of the story too. So I think that's really the essence of what oral storytelling is. And so when, I adapt what I believe are, the elements that I've heard throughout my life from our oral tradition into a written book, I hope that people who read it and would then relay it to others would just pull the same essential things out of it, and maybe, refashion it in their own way, whether that's for adapting it to the screen or to the stage, or, in a graphic novel, or whatever else, right? As long as the main points are there, the main themes, I think that's a way to pay homage to our oral storytelling traditions too. Because, like, you can tell, we have in our culture Nanabush, who's the trickster figure, right? And a lot of Indigenous cultures have this trickster character in their stories. Like, you could hear a Nanabush story here in Sudbury, where I live, and then just go down the highway, half an hour to another First Nation, and hear the same story, but told in a slightly different way, with, a slightly altered plot. But in the end, the moral is going to be exactly the same. And that's sort of how stories travel through the land for our people, since time immemorial, right? So it's not necessarily like staying true to every single detail. It's basically staying true to the moral.
Like, Scott might have a different name in somebody else's story.
Yeah.
He's always going to be a big hulk of man who's a jerk, like right out of
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, as long as that guy's a jerk.
Broad strokes.
Yeah.
Or there.
Yeah.
Are you using the same approach for the sequel for Moon of the Crusted Snow, like working through it as an oral storytelling type experience first?
Yeah, and if it's not sharing it orally with other people, it's committing it to memory first before I write it down. And that was a big part of my process in working through the first one too, but more so the sequel, because I have more time to do it. I quit my day job as a journalist to work full-time as an author. So what I did, I quit CBC in May of 2020, and I spent the rest of that year just developing the story in my head, and obviously taking notes, and forming an outline and some character profiles and that kind of thing. But what I wanted to do was just have the story from start to finish in my head before I actually wrote it down, because I thought, that sort of harkens back to that oral tradition. If I was to sit with somebody, I should be able to tell them the whole story in a few hours if we had that time, right? And once I felt comfortable enough with that knowledge of the story in my imagination and in my memory, that's when I started writing it. So, like, that's, not necessarily traditional, but it's inspired by those traditions for sure.
If you need a Zoom focus group, I'm here for it.
For sure.
Listen to the sequel, like, get an advanced sneak peek what happens to the community. I would love it.
Do you think with in putting these kinds of stories together, I mean, to me, it feels like you're taking a lot of burden and responsibility on your back. Oh, see you, Mike. It seems like you've got a lot of responsibility and burden on your back, meaning you're writing this story that fits a kind of trope system that has to, you have to honor those tropes, or people aren't going to read it the right way. Another thing is you're representing First Nations in general to people, and you're representing, at least some of the different people that you have some cultural relationship with. And then on top of all that, for instance, your antagonist has to be, white guy bad, but not in that way that's just so generic that people like write it off as, ugh, So like, did you feel all that burden, or did you just plow right through and write a book, or like, how did you sit down and type with all that in your head?
Oh, for sure. And I think that's part of that long internal mental development before writing it, is just thinking about all of those factors and how these story elements, how the plot, how the characteristics of the people in it are going to be perceived by all different kinds of people. Most importantly, of course, as an Anishinaabe person from a specific community and a specific family, I'm of course accountable to all those people first and foremost. The
Right.
people who empowered me to be a storyteller, that's who I have to answer to regardless. So I have to make sure that I don't step out of line and that I don't reveal something that shouldn't be written about or shouldn't be widely disseminated through like an interview or anything like that. There are certain ceremonial protocols that should remain in ceremony and not be spoken about amongst people outside of the ceremony, or even written about, of course. So it's thinking about all that. In terms of like writing a white bad guy, it's thinking about that too. And it's also countering that white bad guy with white good people too, because some people could get overly sensitive about that. So yeah, there are big factors for sure to consider, and I think for me it's just what I do is share a lot of like the information about the story with a lot of people beforehand, and then once the draft is together, I'll share the draft with some key people too. Like my dad is a pretty major cultural resource. He's an elder in our culture, and like I have most of the stories I have from him, and from other family members. So I consult with him fairly regularly. I'll say, "Hey, Dad, should I write about this?" And most of the time he'll be like, "Yeah," and other times he'll be like, "Yeah, I don't know. I think that's something we should keep within our community, right? That's not something that we need to tell everybody else about," kind of thing. So
Like the Masons.
yeah, kind of,
You get in
yeah.
trouble.
Yeah. Well, and like I guess the heavier part of that is like people held on to these stories when they potentially risked their own personal safety in terms of
Right.
relaying them, because they were illegal for a long time. It was illegal
Right.
to hold ceremony and to share these cultural things in Canada. So there's some sensitivity around that for sure. But yeah, it's part of my process, and I don't take it for granted at all. Like I take it very seriously, but I also like want to make sure I have fun too. Like it's not like I'm like
Slogging through it.
Yeah, exactly, slogging through it or scowling at the screen as I'm typing away. It's like it's a story for consumption, right? Like it has to be entertaining, so you have to take that into account too.
Scott Woodard wants to know, how does your experience as a journalist inform your fiction writing?
Oh, that's a great question, Scott. A lot. I would say I think working as a journalist really helped me understand the human experience a lot more, and it helped me develop characters in, I think, a more efficient way. And because I don't have like a literary background, I went to university for journalism. Of course, we had English courses all the way through university, but I didn't take a creative writing course or anything like that. So, what I've learned about writing is mostly through reading. But what I've learned about humanity also is primarily my own upbringing and my background, but the literally thousands of people I met while I was working as a journalist, And when you're doing that, you get to meet people in all kinds of situations, responding to those situations in very distinct ways. In thousands of instances, as I said, So I would never, though, take those particular experiences and those moments and write about them myself, because those aren't mine to write about. But they do inform me about how humans can respond to different kinds of things, So even if I'm writing about Evan, like having some sort of dilemma, I'll think, I did a story about this once. What did that person do, or how did they look? How did their eyes crease, or what did their mouth do at that moment? And that'll sort of help me through creating those like empathetic moments, I think. And that's really what I tried to learn as a journalist too, was being as empathetic in order to help like readers, listeners, and viewers connect with the people I was interviewing, right? So yeah, being a journalist, I don't know if I would have been as effective a writer in a literary sense if I wasn't a journalistic writer to begin with.
the character choices feel very true. Like at their core, somebody's fundamentally, say, a decent person or family person or a little bit of a party boy or something.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
all their decisions they make from there on out, I felt like were very true to that. One of the things you just mentioned was you didn't have a literary background or a literary education, but the courses you did take, I've read your comments that it was like your standard middle-aged old white guys, like that kind of lineup of authors. So when did you broaden your horizons to start reading First Nation and Indigenous authors?
Well, that was mostly in high school, and that was back in the 1990s when things were a lot different compared to today, right? In terms of like our wider cultural awareness of different perspectives and different voices and so on. So in the provincial curriculum back then, it was just Shakespeare, J.D. Salinger, W.O. Mitchell, Sir William Golding, but classics nonetheless that I learned from, and in high school is when I first started reading a lot of those dystopian and post-apocalyptic classics like 1984, Brave New World, Fahrenheit 451, all those things influenced and inspired me for sure. But it wasn't until I got to about grade 11th grade, that an aunt of mine started showing me books by Indigenous authors, people like Thomas King, Louise Erdrich, Lee Maracle, Richard Waughemes, people I didn't know existed because they weren't, being filtered through me through the education system, right? So that really opened my eyes to the possibilities of Indigenous storytelling in a literary way. And then when I went to university, the English courses I had then were a lot more, I think, diverse, like the subject matter. There were a lot more voices we covered, like Toni Morrison, Ralph Ellison, again, Louise Erdrich, just all these important voices that I learned about in my early adulthood. And that was really informative too. So like, of course, like the white authors are some of my favorites, and that's how I learned about a lot of literary formats. But it wasn't until reading books by authors of more diverse backgrounds that I saw the potential for my own people's stories in that, because there's a way to convey your own distinct existence outside of like that so-called canon of what we've been led to believe literature is, So all of that together, worked well for me in terms of learning. But it was reading books, especially by Indigenous and Black authors, that really inspired me to do it on my own.
So go check out Storykeepers podcast, because that's one a month, right? Where you have a co-host who's another First Nation or Indigenous creator, and you talk about a book written by an Indigenous author. Is that right?
Yeah. Thanks for the plug. My co-host and friend Jennifer David, she came up with the idea to make essentially like an Indigenous book club once a month, where we feature a book by an Indigenous author and we bring in another Indigenous person to talk about it. And it's been a lot of fun. It's not something we do very intensely. It's sort of one of our side sort of gigs for each of us. And like we don't adhere to that strict of a format or that strict of a sort of critical directive in some ways. We just want to talk about the book, right? And it's been a lot of fun. So
fun for listeners too. Go check it out.
Cool, thanks.
Storykeepers podcast. So my pop has a comment. It might cover you a little bit. It's a little big. Enjoying the way you share your life and thoughts. Your thoughtfulness shows through. Also enjoy that you pronounce process the way that you do, because my dad also tries to say it that way.
I didn't even know it's process. Is that how I say it? Or
you said process, Mr.
Okay, good.
Stronman, Ontarian.
You say process.
Yeah, I'm glad I got dad's approval. Awesome. Right on.
There you go. So here we are. We're at this point in our show where we do this.
Oh, and here's our person of the day. Kaboom!
And I had somebody in mind. Yeah, you know what? I'm throwing it over to my pop. I like this little thing. And there's
how about a little nepotism, Dad?
Nepotism's allowed. We didn't read any ads, so you know what? They could all read our ads later. They know what's we also ask every person who ever comes on the show what goes in your backpack. This could be something physical, it could be something metaphorical. It could be hope for the future. It could be a
extra
chipmunk skull.
Extra
set of teeth.
You know what?
Waubgeshig Rice on your birthday. What are you going to put in this backpack?
You know, there are so many different physical things I could choose from, but I think I'll go metaphorical. And one thing I'll say I always have in my backpack is patience, a sense
Mm.
of really allowing things to unfold the way they should, not rushing things, and knowing that, you know, as long as I, you know, keep an open mind and, you know, keep a positive outlook. And as long as I, you know, keep everybody around me as happy and healthy as possible, things will work out the way they should. So I think patience is something I learned from my parents for sure. You know, coming from a pretty humble background, and it's what I try to, I guess, invoke when I'm being a dad myself. You know, with my own 2 little kids.
So if
So
there's an apocalypse, I'm pretty screwed if patience is what's required.
that's probably it too. You know, it's like, oh well, better wait this out, see what happens. You know,
I'm like Leroy Jenkins, just right in there.
Well, I can tell you this about Patience. One of my grandmother's favorite bands with Guns N' Roses. And
nice.
so when you say Patience, of course, we have to sing that song. And I was just thinking about that and how she used to pull out the old guitar.
Nice. She tuned